Hi YouTube, my name is Jack. It is unseasonably warm here in New Jersey. It has been in the high 70s every day this week, so I figured I would sit outside, enjoy the sunshine, and talk a little bit about witchcraft. I don't have a good microphone, so I'm just using the built-in microphone on my computer. Hopefully there's not too much background noise. If there is, bear with me. Um, what I wanted to talk about today is not just witchcraft, but witchcraft as the meaning of that term is sort of understood in contemporary discourse, which is different from how we've understood it in the past, and how it does or does not apply to Wicca. So, in the pagan publishing boom of the 1990s, there was a real sort of push for everything to be Wicca. Wicca and witchcraft were interchangeable terms in the way that they were used in publishing, and a lot of people who were publishing in what we would now consider traditional witchcraft or non-Wiccan witchcraft were sort of pressured into marketing themselves as Wicca because Wicca was the thing. And nowadays, we see things really swinging very far in the other direction, where witchcraft is described as a practice that has nothing to do with religion. So Wicca is identified as a pagan religion. Witchcraft is a particular kind of magical practice. And witchcraft is not only defined as not being inherently Wiccan, but some people in popular discourse, good God, does someone have a leaf blower going back there? I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you can hear the leaf blower. I should go inside and film this video in there, but it's so nice outside, and that's not going to last. Anyway, some people go so far as to say not only is witchcraft not inherently Wiccan, it is inherently not Wiccan. That Wiccans are doing something else altogether that cannot really appropriately be classed as witchcraft. So there's a lot of jockeying over the legitimacy of the term witch, who gets to call themselves a witch, what witchcraft is, that whole ballgame. And so I want to take some time just to unpack that. Particularly because, right, Wicca introduces itself to the world as a witch religion, as a witch cult. And that has a couple of layers of meaning to it. The idea of the witch cult is, of course, doesn't originate with, but sort of most famously can be linked to Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. There we go, we'll get that in the light there. And Gardner and the people who came before him were really strongly influenced by this witch cult hypothesis, this idea that the people who had been persecuted as witches during the early modern period had actually been the secret practitioners of a surviving pagan witch religion. And Margaret Murray, interestingly enough, identifies two kinds of witchcraft in her book. She identifies operative witchcraft and ritual witchcraft as two forms of witchcraft that are distinct from each other. And this is a terminological distinction that I actually think would be really helpful for us to reintroduce as we start to talk about witchcraft, Wicca, and the relationship between the two. Operative witchcraft, according to Margaret Murray, is just casting spells, just doing magic. And anyone can do operative witchcraft regardless of whether they're a member of the witch cult. So she actually has several instances in the book where she talks about types of operative witchcraft that are done, for example, by Catholic clergy, right? Rites of benediction or, blessings and protections and things like that. Folk charms that are intended to keep evil at bay. She classes all of these sorts of things as operative witchcraft, regardless of whether the people doing them would consider themselves witches. Ritual witchcraft, on the other hand, Margaret Murray suggests, is a religion. Ritual witchcraft is the set of rites that are performed by members of the witch cult who are worshipping their horned deity. God, that leaf blower is really loud. Should I go inside? I'm gonna go inside. Alright, I'm back. Hopefully the audio from that first section was usable, because I don't really want to refilm it, but there is less background noise now. Ritual witchcraft, according to Margaret Murray, is the set of rites that are performed by members of the witch cult, the survivors of this pagan religion, who are worshipping a horned fertility deity who can appear either as a horned god or as the moon goddess Diana. There's sort of a complicated relationship there. And so ritual witchcraft is really fundamentally about religion. It's not about spellcasting. And Margaret Murray specifies that practitioners of ritual witchcraft are also doing operative witchcraft. So the rites of this pagan witchcraft religion are going to include spells cast to increase the fertility of the land, to blight enemies of the witch cult, to bless, to curse, to cause people to fall in love, all the usual stuff. But the real orientation of ritual witchcraft, in Margaret Murray's eyes, is religious rather than practical. And this is, I think, an important distinction because when Wicca first comes on the scene, it's imagining itself and it presents itself as a type of ritual witchcraft primarily, rather than a type of operative witchcraft. So Wicca introduces itself as a witch religion. And most of what Gardner brings onto the scene is a set of rituals, a ritual framework provided to facilitate the experience of certain religious mysteries, which are connected to the moon goddess and her consort, the horned god. Most of the emphasis of early Wiccan materials is on that ritual witchcraft, the religious experience of it, and less so on the operative witchcraft and the spellcasting. Now, again, members of Gardner's witch cult, members of initiatory traditional Wicca, do perform spells. They do participate in operative witchcraft. But Wicca itself, the framework of Wicca, is primarily oriented toward the religious purpose of a ritual witchcraft. And the spellcasting is less fleshed out in Gardner's Wicca. That's not to say that it's unimportant. So I think this is really, really crucial, right? Spellcasting is an important part of Wicca. I know a lot of traditional covens, not all of them because there's so much variation from one coven to the next, but a lot of traditional covens really strongly feel that casting spells is our duty as witches, and they will insist on doing spell work every time they meet for an esbat. That's a pretty common occurrence, is this real insistence on we are not just a religious order, we are witches, we do spell work, that is part of our duty. So I don't mean to say that operative witchcraft is not important in Gardner's Wicca, rather that it's not built up in quite the same way. So Gardner gives a lot of ritual for the religious part of it. He gives a lot of ritual for sort of creating sacred space and coming into communion with the gods and things like that. There's less in the way of like really specific ritual for operative witchcraft and spellcasting. A lot of that is left more to sort of individual circumstances, to the intuition and taste of the practitioners involved. A lot of it is left to sort of building up a spell for a particular occasion. Now, there are particular techniques of spellcasting that are uniquely Wiccan, that are introduced with traditional Wicca, and that remain a core part of traditional Wicca. Obviously, I can't talk about those in detail, but there is such a thing as a particularly Wiccan type of magical working. And more broadly, part of what happens when Gardner introduces his witchcraft onto the scene is that he democratizes magic and makes it more accessible and simpler in a way that it really hadn't been before. So the dominant paradigm in occultism prior to Gardner, not to say that it was the only paradigm, but if you went looking for magic, a lot of what you would find would be this very elaborate and expensive ceremonial setup. Whether you're talking about Key of Solomon style grimoire magic, whether you're talking about Golden Dawn style Hermetic and Kabbalistic magic, but it would be a version of magic that involved a lot of setup, a lot of ceremony, a lot of tools, very particular timing required for certain kinds of things. You would usually need to have access to a lot of books. You would need to be very well read. You'd need to be able to read Latin or Greek or Hebrew. And it would be inaccessible and difficult. If you didn't have a lot of money, if you had to work a 9-to-5 job and you couldn't be performing a ritual at the day and hour of Mercury, if you couldn't afford to buy all of these fancy tools and get, thread spun by a virgin, all of these things made magic much less accessible, much less doable. And part of what we see when Gardner introduces his witch cult to the world is the idea that magic can actually be something very simple, very down-to-earth, very practical, and accessible to anyone. Gardner brings in a kind of approach to magic that says, we pay attention to the phases of the moon, but we don't really have to be focused on the planetary day and the planetary hour and the aspect of Mercury to Mars. We have certain ritual tools that we use, but a lot of it is sort of make do, right? Do the best you have with what you have. So, witches, according to Gardner, get a lot of their tools in like thrift shops and, things like that, or they're handed down to them, as opposed to going through these elaborate processes of making or buying very expensive and hard to find tools. Gardner is not the only one who is democratizing magic in this way and making it more accessible. Austin Osman Spare is also doing a very similar thing by taking the really elaborate, complicated ceremonial magic and simplifying it and making it more direct and accessible. But Gardner is one of the really important figures who helped shape that attitude toward magic being something that anyone can do. And we really see that in, I think, a lot of discourse now about witchcraft, about magic. A lot of the way that people think about magic is really influenced by this attitude toward magic that Gardner publicized. And that's not to say that people are doing the same kind of magic that Gardner was, or that they owe all of their magic to Gardner. None of that, right? But just to say that, I think what we think about when we say witchcraft is pretty heavily influenced by the way that Gardner started talking about magic, even if we're doing a very different kind of magic than what Gardner did, or even if we're not participating in Gardner's framework of ritual witchcraft and we're only doing operative witchcraft. Obviously I'm biased because I am Wiccan, and I do a fuck ton of spells. Not a fuck ton. I do spells when they need to be done. I don't do them for the sake of doing them. But if I have a thing that needs to be done, I put some magical oomph behind it. And so obviously I'm going to come out on the side of Wicca here. But when these conversations start to arise about what is witchcraft, who gets to claim the title of witch, and more recently, do Wiccans get to count as witches? My attitude is very much yes. I think that Wiccans absolutely are witches. We're not the only people who get to call ourselves witches, and that's important. But Wiccans are witches because we're participating in operative witchcraft. We're doing spellcasting. There are particular Wiccan methods of spellcasting. Because Wicca has really deeply influenced the idea of witchcraft and of sort of witches' magic, that exists in the popular discourse today, even among people who aren't Wiccan. And because Wicca is drawing on not just operative witchcraft, but this sort of Margaret Murray-esque secondary tradition of ritual witchcraft, in order to build up a complex ritual framework. I think when we talk about witchcraft, we can mean a number of different things, and it's really important to clarify exactly how we're using that term, right? There are a whole lot of other layers to what constitutes witchcraft I'm not really going into here. One of the big ones is that witchcraft tends to be understood not just as magic and spellcasting, but magic that's done in a particularly subversive or transgressive way. I haven't really touched on that here, but that's a conversation worth having at some point. But I think that certainly when Wicca comes onto the scene, it's drawing on the ways that people are talking about witchcraft at the time, both in the sense of the operative and the ritual forms of witchcraft. Wicca is presenting itself, Wicca is identifying as witchcraft in the terms in which witchcraft was being discussed in the mid 20th century. And then there's this weird period that happens at the end of the 20th century where Wicca and witchcraft just get completely conflated. And I think now what we're seeing 30 years later is a lot of people sort of trying to untangle some of that. But in trying to untangle that, I think we should be really careful not to deny the ways in which Wicca is a form of witchcraft, because it really is. And it's not only an important form of witchcraft, or rather, it's not only a form of witchcraft, it's an important one. It's one that's had a lot of influence, and that has really affected what we mean when we say witchcraft, even for the people who aren't Wiccan initiates. So, gonna leave that there. Thank you for watching. Sorry about the incident with the leaf blower, and I will talk to you sometime soon. Bye.